Reginald here. This one's just going to be a quick discussion. I'd like to state right from the outset that I have absolutely nothing against JTClive. I like his content. I watch his content. I've used his concepts in my videos before. So this is really just a discussion in its purest form and a disagreement on a few points. The first one's probably the most obvious, which is, I mean, look, you say chain axe and you summon me, and he's talking about the Mark IV chain axe and presumably the Mark XII as well. So let's just go ahead and review that footage and I'll comment as we go.
The chain axes used to be so bad that they made the Emperor himself weep, but now they're actually not bad.
Yes, the chain axe used to be bad, and I put hundreds and hundreds of hours into it while it was bad and liked it anyway. And now, far from just being okay, the Mark IV chain axe is actually really good, and the Mark XII chain axe is pretty good.
However, they are often overshadowed by the chain swords due to the chain sword's superior horde clear and good single target damage.
My first reaction to this, I actually assumed he was talking about the eviscerators and not the chain swords and just sort of used the wrong word, but actually he really means the one-handed chain swords here, and I actually don't know what he's talking about in this case. For starters, the chain axes do have a niche, and I'll explain in a second, but I don't see how the chain swords overshadow them at all. All the chain swords manage to do better than the chain axes is have good horde clear. When it comes to single target damage, they're far inferior in most cases. The chain axes, on the other hand, have worse horde clear, and in exchange, they are excellent at elite sniping and monstrosity busting. But all of the chain weapons are kind of versatile in nature and are pretty good against anything depending on your tastes. The chain swords have generally excellent defensive mobility, the chain axes have great sprint efficiency, and the heavy chain sword is the slowest of the bunch in terms of mobility, but has the most flexibility for targets. And I can prove this with the data that I have on hand. As you can see here, the chain axe has perfectly decent horde clear compared to other weapons, but if you look, the chain swords are definitely better. However, once you get into the heavier targets like Ragers, Crushers, and Chaos Spawn, you can see the chain axe is actually outperforming those things. So the niche of the chain axe then is a generalist weapon with elite sniping capabilities and monster busting availability, while the niche of the chain sword is a high defensive mobility, horde clear weapon with some flex into elite busting and boss busting.
Chain axes, while viable, don't really fill a niche, and a single change to them can easily give them a niche and reason to run over the chain swords. Grant chain axes an increased dodge limit and dodge distance.
Okay, this next bit also confuses me. Let's just take it on face value. If we agree that the chain axes don't have a niche, which we don't, but let's just say we do. If we agree that they don't have a niche, how does giving them in a superior dodge count and dodge distance give them any kind of niche at all? What does that get them? They're the fastest moving chain weapon? It seems like that doesn't do anything for an actual niche, because the chain sword will still be the one that's good at hordes, and the heavy chain sword will still be the one that's good at everything, and then what is the chain axe for? So if the chain axe needs a niche, it needs to be good at some enemy type. Fortunately, it is actually the best at flexing into various types of elites and dealing with armored enemies, not least because, unlike the chain sword, the light attacks and special attacks are capable of staggering Crushers out of their overheads, as well as stunning Ragers with just a single light attack.
It makes absolutely zero sense why the chain axes have a lower dodge than the heavy eviscerators. One-handed weapons should always have higher dodge than two-handed weapons, and the chain axes should receive dodge buffs to reflect this.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with this on its face, but I do think that ultimately it's a game balance decision. The chain axe has so much versatility and effectiveness that it has to have something that it's bad at, so it might as well be this.
Specifically, they should be changed to have the dodge profile of the Mark VI heavy sword, which grants it a slight advantage over the chain swords and makes it the more agile of the two chain weapon families, and also helps to make up its lack of horde clear compared to the chain swords.
You might think I would prefer a weapon that I like to be buffed into the stratosphere so that it can be the best toy ever. It's actually the opposite for me. I want to see my favorite weapon be in a good balanced position so that I have challenges to overcome while using it, because that's what makes Tide games fun. And let me just linger on this one just a little longer. It is my favorite weapon, of course. The chain axe is actually one of the best balanced weapons in the game right now. And the reason for that is it has a good distribution of negatives to positives. It's kind of hard to use, but if you master it, you can get insane output against elites and specialists and armored elites and monstrosities. It's definitely a little slower on the horde clear side, but it's not unusable at all. It has a great defensive moveset with a sweeping, stamina efficient push attack, and the stamina efficiency as an upside allows you to run around very quickly since it is low drain on your sprint. However, it has kind of bad dodges. Upshot, it has great stagger on its heavy attacks and its light attacks for headshots against larger targets, and its special attack. So you get this nice mix of like, it's good against some targets and kind of bad against other targets. It has good stagger, but it's a little slow moving. And all of that makes for a weapon that has a nice internal balance with itself and also with other weapons. There's plenty of other niches to go to, like the chainsword itself, which has the niche of being much better at horde clear and better mobility. Alright, let's move on to the next section on the Thunderhammer.
While no one will disagree about the absolute beast these babies are at killing bosses and elites,
well, let me stop you there. This thing is good against bosses. It is not good against elites. It's trash against elites. It shouldn't be, but it is.
They really struggle to deal with the larger elite hordes and are a little lacking when it comes to general horde control. So here's what I would do. First, entirely remove the self-stun after a special infused attack. There is no reason why we should be stunned after hitting someone with it, and its removal would make it not only so much more effective versus hordes of elites, but it would also just make the weapon handle so much better and be a nice quality of life improvement. Second, the cleave profiles of the hammers should be increased slightly overall. And third, buff its stagger power.
Okay, that seems like a good place to stop and make my comment. I actually really hate this design paradigm. We're going to see more of it as well, which is, hey, let's take away the things that make the weapon feel really distinct from other weapons by having its downsides removed so we can have all upside. That is an absolute mistake in the design paradigm. It will make all of the weapons feel like gray mush. The reason the Thunderhammer has a self-stun in the first place, which has been nerfed more than once, by the way, is because it's supposed to deliver some insane output, and there needed to be a balancing factor for that. Instead of having any kind of balancing factor for insane output, we have balancing factor for really mediocre output. In fact, as I have mentioned, this thing does not do well against elites. Here's the table. This is the Iron Helm and the Crucius. They are worse than the chain weapons against Crusher hordes. That doesn't make much sense, does it? The singular thing that hammers are good for in this game at this time is boss slaying. That's it. All they're good for, and they're actually too good at it. So here's what I would do. JTC is right that it's hard to fight large elite groups due to the self-stagger. So let's just even the floorboards a little bit here. Let's give the hammers a small AoE stagger. That way, when you deliver a powered attack into an enemy, if there are some elites right next to you, they will also be staggered by the concussion blast. This means there's still a downside because other enemies could rush up on you, but at least the ones immediately adjacent to your target aren't going to slap you the second you hit them. You will still have to play smart with the hammer, but you'll have at least something in the way of a safety net. Second thing I would do here is way crank up the output of damage. This is my absolutely insanely well-rolled Crucius hammer. I mean, it only gets a little better than this, and I can't even kill a Mauler or Crusher on a headshot with all stacks of thrust. As to the other two buffs, I agree. It should be returned to its previously effective stagger state, and it should have a little better cleave against heavier targets so that you can actually fight in a horde without bouncing off the nearest Mauler body.
What was once the most overpowered weapon in the game, the Heavy Bolter has unfortunately become a shadow of its former self. The Heavy Bolter...
Look, I know that I am a 40k nerd, not everybody is, and that's fine, but this is not a Heavy Bolter. This is a Heavy Bolter. This is just a bolt gun, a bolter. And I know he mentions it in a minute, they are not mostly used by Space Marines. They are most notably used by Space Marines. The lore actually indicates that bolt guns are more numerous, though not more common, in the Guard than they are in the Space Marine legions, and that's just because there are so many more guardsmen out there using various kinds of equipment, including bolt guns. Not only that, but the bolt gun is common to the Arbites as well. Space Marines use the Godwin pattern bolt gun. Sororitas use the Godwin Diaz pattern bolt gun, which is a scaled down variant designed for power armored Sisters of Battle to use. And we are actually using the Locke pattern bolt gun, which is a variant used by the Arbites, and it says so right here. There's nothing especially special about Arbites, they're just regular dudes who probably lift weights. So now that I've put that piece of old lore to rest, I'd like to just mention that the Heavy Bolter should be available to the Ogryn. Please hurry up and then get back on topic.
It absolutely was too powerful on launch and needed nerfs.
I mean, I actually don't, and I didn't argue for nerfs for the bolt gun. I actually thought the problem was always that Veteran had an instant reload for it. It was strong, but it was appropriately strong for the lore. The problem that it had was that the Veteran could instantly reload 15 rounds by just tapping a button, and then having just tapped that button, they would still have full stacks of pinning fire on the weapon before it expired to then get full value of that pinning fire on an entire 15-round magazine of bolt gun ammo with all the plus power that entailed. That problem was solved instantly when they removed the ability for the veteran to instantly reload the gun. Unfortunately, they also nerfed the heck out of the bolter around the same time, and ever since then it's just been a real sad state.
But I also don't enjoy seeing it overshadowed by the revolver.
I'm with you on that point.
In my opinion, the bolter should be buffed in accordance with how the weapon functions lore-wise in 40k as a whole.
Let me just stop here and agree strongly with this position. I think 40k lore should always inform the balance. It should be one aspect of the balance discussion. Now, it shouldn't be the whole balance discussion, and I do think there is room for some wiggling around the lore. For example, the chain axe, my favorite toy. It's actually probably too good against carapace armor. Yes, lore-wise, it's better against armor than other forms of chain weapons, but I mean, it's not that much better if you look at some of the other tabletop sources like Fantasy Flight's games Rogue Trader. And to be perfectly honest, the Force swords don't really have any business being particularly good against heavily armored Ogrins and carapace armor. They should be mostly shrugging off those attacks due to their armor, as Force weapons typically, at least back when I played a lot of 40k, weren't any good against armored targets, but they were good against characters if they could bypass their armor. So they might kill an unarmored Ogrin, but not an armored Ogrin. But in both cases, I think we should take the balance of the game in mind and just say, hey, there needs to be something for these weapons to do better than other weapons, and one of those things can be killing heavy armored enemies like maulers and crushers instead of leaving them bad. So there needs to be a balance, but I definitely favor the concept of kind of tapping into the lore to inform our decisions. Chain axes are supposed to be good against armor, and Force swords are supposed to be good against characters, so why not kind of roll that into being good against crushers and maulers?
Bolt guns are incredibly powerful, but incredibly difficult to wield and control, which is why you really only see Space Marines using them and not that many normal humans. This is reflected in-game by its long reload time, long draw time, and low accuracy / high recoil. And in order to keep that overall fantasy of the weapon, these aspects of the bolter should be kept and not receive many buffs, if any at all. However, the solution is also not as simple as just buffing its damage. Doing that would just make it overpowered again on veteran and cause another 2022 Darktide bolter meta, so the tweaks this weapon needs must fall in between these two restrictions.
Okay, so I think I'm following you here. The idea is to avoid making this thing OP by buffing it, but we are going to buff it some, I presume, and then we're going to want to keep some of the bad handling in order to make that balance out.
Keeping them in mind, here is what I would suggest. First, cut down the time it takes to deploy the weapon by roughly 50%.
So I timed the Agrippina Mark I infantry auto gun, and that came out at about 1.08 seconds. So 1.3 seconds is only a little slower. I agree it's a little too slow considering the type of game we have and the number of enemies on screen, but we still need to make it chunky. I favor 1.5.
Second, significantly boost its overall stagger power. Similar to the Thunderhammers, the bolt gun can no longer hard stagger crushers or maulers and needs a stagger boost so that it can. Third, reduce the amount of shots required to open up bulwark shields by 1 so that bulwarks no longer hard stop bolters from functioning.
Sure, I'm with you on these 2 points.
And finally, entirely overhaul the base breakpoints of the bolter. Here are how many body shots it takes for the bolter to kill various enemies in the game in Damnation, some of which are egregiously bad. These breakpoints should be altered, such as allowing the bolter to one-shot body shot every trash unit in the game, and reducing the number of Poxhound body shots required down to no more than 2.
I am definitely in broad agreement on this camp, actually. The Poxwalkers thing is ridiculous, the Poxhounds thing is ridiculous. It should be 1 headshot, 2 body shots for Poxhounds, that's fine. Reapers being around 5 or 6 makes sense to me. I'm not sure why Crushers and Bulwarks are in the same spot here. 5 or 6 is more than adequate for, say, a Bulwark, but Crushers are wearing carapace armor, unlike Bulwarks. Bolters have no lore or canonical basis or even rules basis for penetrating carapace armor better than most other weapons. The modern rules set gives them like a -1 if they are bolt rifles, but we're not even talking about a bolt rifle in the first place. This is just a bolt gun. Bolt guns, at best, were good against flak armor, and at worst, in more modern rule sets, aren't even good against flak armor. Though my headcanon for bolters is still that they penetrate flak armor just fine.
But you must once again be careful increasing the breakpoints of certain types of damage with the bolter. Increasing the damage versus infested and carapace enemies is no problem and should be done quite heavily.
Okay, wait, what? Those things aren't even close to the same paradigm of enemy types. Infested is just poxwalkers and poxhounds at this point. I hope it's more someday, but for right now, that's all you get. But those are just low-tier trash enemies in the first place. Ogrins in carapace armor are a whole other beast in terms of lore and in terms of rule set. There's no real lore basis nor tabletop rule set basis for bolt guns to be especially good against carapace, especially carapace being worn by an Ogrin.
But the same cannot be said for flak armor nor unyielding, due to how many enemies are protected by the former and bosses all using the latter.
I actually don't know why we're saying that it shouldn't be said for flak armor or unyielding. If there's anything that the bolt gun would actually be good against, it is both flak armor and unyielding targets. The bolt gun is much more handy compared to other weapons anyway against unyielding targets because, look, it's a higher strength weapon, so it has better odds of actually damaging those tougher, bigger enemies. Whereas flak armored enemies are typically, historically, being able to be penetrated by a bolt gun's bolt round, and flak armor is not that great of armor in the first place. It's better than nothing for sure, but it's never been great armor. I also don't really understand this justification. Why is flak armor affecting a lot of enemies reason to make flak armor not the obvious target of the bolt gun? The bolt gun should generally be consistent across weaker targets, which is what mostly flak armor enemies are. It should just be strong against flak, just like it's strong against unarmored and should be strong against unarmored. I kind of understand wanting the bolt gun not to be incredible against bosses, and so being a little leery of buffing against unyielding too much, and I agree with that point, but perhaps we can buff it a little, because unless you're running a crazy tricked out vet build for it, it's really not going to be like one-tapping any monstrosities. And I'm pretty okay with needing to dump around 30 rounds of a bolt gun to kill a Plague Ogrin. The correct way to balance that out would just be to make the ammo cost a little more expensive.
I don't have a perfect mathematical answer on how to balance the bolter in regards to flak armor, but an easy and effective way to buff it in the meantime is by heavily increasing its infested and carapace armor damage while only slightly increasing its unyielding damage to ensure it doesn't become a boss melter. The bolter should be an incredibly powerful anti-armor tool.
Yeah, let me just stop there again. It absolutely shouldn't be an incredibly powerful anti-armor tool. There's no basis in lore for it to be an incredibly powerful anti-armor tool, unless you're using Kraken rounds. And that's not really something the average Imperial Guardsman or Arbite or Inquisitorial agent's going to have access to. Kraken rounds are more of a Space Marine special. It's really not appropriate for the bolt gun to be great at cracking carapace. It is much more appropriate for the bolt gun to be cracking soft-bodied targets, maniac targets, absolutely infested targets. Honestly, it's super weird that the exploding round that detonates inside the target doesn't do better against infested than a bunch of cold slugs that are zipping through a bunch of pus. And since unyielding is typically unarmored, especially for Plague Ogrins and the like, I don't see why the bolt gun wouldn't be a little bit better there than other options as well. But carapace armor is exactly the kind of thing that should be making the bolt gun not good, and that's the exact kind of weakness that the bolt gun should have. And that's where its stagger advantage can come into play for sure, but this would be a waste of your very powerful ammo. Not only that, but it's better balanced against other weapons in the game. There's this trend I keep seeing whenever someone says, this weapon isn't very good. Well, let's make it good against crushers. And I think that's a mistake. I think crushers should only have a small selection of weaknesses. Every weapon should be able to deal with them to some level. I don't want, to be stuck fighting a crusher for 30 minutes because I didn't bring the right kit, but we don't need to be in this place where every weapon is efficient against crushers. It's acceptable for something to be like the heavy sword, where you can technically fight a couple of crushers with your special attack, spam combo, whatever, but it does take a long time, and that gives you an incentive to bring other weapons and tools to the table that are especially good at that. And you've got two weapons, so you could make pairings and combos. That adds a little spice and variety to the game. Maybe you bring the bolt gun to deal with most of the enemies on the table, and then you bring a thunder hammer or a shock maul or a chain axe to the table to help deal with the occasional crusher that you need to personally deal with, the rest of your team can't. Maybe your teammate brought a plasma gun and you've got a bolt gun. Now you've got a nice little combo between the two of you. If I'm bringing Lad's pistol and Catachin sword because I want to do that, then I should probably bring some crack grenades at the very minimum. That makes building your kit a little bit more interesting. Not everything has to do everything, although I'm aware the Catachin sword can do some funny stuff with the parry.
But should not trivialize absolutely everything the game throws at you, and these changes best reflect this and still leave the bolter with some weaknesses, including sniping, horde clearing, and monster killing.
Alright, well, I agree with the first part, which is that the bolt gun should have weaknesses. That That's true, but I'm not sure that it has any of the weaknesses that JTClive is listing here. It's perfectly good against hordes and always has been, and it's definitely going to be better against hordes when we increase the damage against infested so that it only takes one body shot to kill them. It's perfectly fine for sniping maniacs and specialists as it is, and it will only be better when we make the dogs easier to kill, so this kind of is more competitive in the sniping front than it was before, although it's still kind of slow to draw. And the last point was that it wasn't a great boss killer, but like it's already kind of okay at boss killing depending on your talent pool. Anyway, I think that's sufficient for the bolt gun. I guess I'll add my thoughts here on what we should actually do with the bolt gun and the bolt pistol, which I've already kind of talked about. It's the same problems, right? First of all, we really need to fix the ADS jank on the bolters. It makes them hard to shoot. The bolt pistol has it, the bolt gun has it, whatever it is. I'm okay with reducing the draw time on the bolter to 1.5 seconds instead of 2, but we don't have to do that. It can be just a weakness of the weapon. And I actually strongly favor JTClive's suggested differences in breakpoints. I want to see one-tap body shots on every basic scab enemy. So scab shooters, stalkers, bruisers. I want to see that on dreg bruisers and stalkers, poxwalkers and groaners. I want to see improved body shot kills against gunners, and I want to see better damage against mauler body shots. I want to see better damage against ragers and flak ragers and shotgunners, and I want to see better body shot damage across the board against specialists. Furthermore, for both bolt weapons, I would like to see arms not reduce the damage. Limb damage should be the same as body shot damage, which should be a flat profile across all of them. This way, if you tap someone in the arm and it eats your shot and it blows up, they still die. One way this could be done that has been suggested to me is to actually make the explosion of the projectile do more damage to the target hit, so that you get the actual effect of hitting the target with the projectile and then having that projectile detonate inside them, killing them with the explosion damage, blowing off limbs, blowing them up, whatever it is. What I would like to see is no real improvements on carapace armor. This can stay, and should stay, the niche for the plasma gun, the hotshot lasguns, or Lucius lasguns, and ideally, one day, the long las and melt-a-gun.
And lastly, Zealot's Heavy Flamer. I will say that I am not surprised Fury of the Faithful got the nerf that it did, as it didn't seem intended on launch, but nerfing Fury without reverting the nerfs done on the Flamer absolutely destroys any semblance of armor clearing it had. The Flamer needs inherent armor penetration in order for it to function. It doesn't have to be much, as Flamers are generally supposed to be general fodder cleaners rather than elite killers, but it needs a boost of some kind. I mean, just look at this.
Finally, JTClive talks about the Flamer. Once again, calling it the Heavy Flamer, it's not, but I'll restrain my digression, it's not a big deal. And describes it in terms that I basically agree with. However, we bring up the Carapace armor again, and I, again, don't see any reason why the Flamer would be good against Carapace armored Ogrins. It really should just be trash against those. And it should be kind of bad against Maulers and kind of bad against Flak Ragers, but not Dreg Ragers. I've always felt that was the best way to balance this, was to allow enemies wearing a lot of Flak armor to be a little bit more resistant. I know, lore-wise, typically, the Flamer has been able to penetrate flak armor, and that's fine, but they should be more resistant than enemies wearing no armor, and that would allow the balance of the game itself to feel better. Again, the goal is to be informed by lore, but still account for the balance of the game. The one thing I don't want to happen is to have the Flamer just be a turn off the game button the way Smite currently is. It should be the case that the Flamer should turn off hordes and be able to damage other enemies in a reasonable timescale where other players still get to participate. One of the things to do if we have problems with the Flamer, and I know they just buffed it as I am editing this, you know, the Flamer is better now, and I haven't had a chance to see how good it is, but let's just say the Flamer is way out of whack again, it's really strong. What we need to do is to look at the amount of reserve ammunition, not the trigger time. If I only get to fire it a couple of times and I have trouble getting ammo back, that is a better way to balance that weapon overall. Let me use it in a way that I am turning off the horde, not every time there's a horde, but tactically, understanding that there is a time and a place to use the Flamer, and when I use it, I will be able to delete whatever is around, but I can't use it all the time. With that, I'm going to actually add a few weapons that I think need a little bit of help. The Cantrell Mark 10 Heavy Las pistol is kind of in a weird spot and needs a little love. The Lawbringer and Agrippina shotguns both need better scatter shot damage. They're just a little too weak on their actual damage now that everything got buffed up in patch 13 and 14. The Vrax Mark 7 Headhunter autogun is in a bad place. It's in competition with the revolver and is the rifle variant of the revolver, one might say, a accurate long-range rifle, and yet it is really bad against maniacs and specialists, taking 2 to 3 shots to kill flamers and trappers. Much like the Lucius lasguns, it really needs a sight of some kind, and preferably one with some magnification. 2 to 4x, like one of those 2 4s you get in Apex Legends, would probably be ideal. Okay, that's got to be enough out of me. I know this has been a longer video than I anticipated, but I hope you had a little fun talking about balance with me. It's always an interest of mine to discuss the total balance in Darktide, and I enjoyed talking about JTC's suggestions and kind of going through them and figuring out what works and what doesn't work. I hope JTC doesn't take any offense, because I, of course, like the discussion that he brings to the table most of the time around balance, and I actually agree with a lot of his presuppositions many times, and I've found them very informative for other balance discussions I have done. So no shade again being thrown here. I just wanted to sort of disagree on the things I disagree with. So I will put a link to JTClive's video in the description below so that you could go watch it if you'd like. Have a lovely day, everyone. Thanks so much for visiting. Bye-bye.